Determining the impact of the Western aid that was provided to the Soviet Union in the Second World War is quite controversial. This aid was provided under the Lend-Lease Act. As such, it usually is just called Lend-Lease. The majority of the support was provided by the United States, yet other countries like the United Kingdom and Canada aided the Soviet Union as well. Now, even without the Cold War, the topic would be quite delicate. After all, there were even issues between the United Kingdom and the United States. The evaluation of a Lend-Lease has been a major source of controversy. The Prime Minister described it as the most unsorted act in the history of any nation. Others, however, including Keynes, have been less charitable, seeing American self-interest behind the aid. And in all fairness, it should be mentioned that the United Kingdom actually received the lion's share of Lend-Lease from the United States, which spent about $50 billion, of which $31 billion went to the United Kingdom, whereas only $10.2 billion went to the Soviet Union. Which to a certain degree is explained by the fact that the British received a lot of military equipment, whereas the Soviets received more raw and intermediate products like industrial equipment and resources. Yet for now, let's skip the political factors, since there are plenty of other factors that make it so hard to determine the importance and limits of the Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. First, if we assume for a moment that we would have perfect numbers, even then it would be hard to determine the impact. Because when it comes to Lend-Lease, the quality of various goods was crucial. Because a lack of high technology, high quality equipment could not be counterbalanced by increasing the availability of low-grade goods and human services, since Soviet industry could not match the quality of flow products of American electrical and mechanical engineering and petrochemicals. Foreign resources could not be replaced by domestic resources. Yet quality is only one aspect. For instance, the Russian historian Sokolov notes the following about the previously quoted author. Mark Harrison calculates mainly in terms of weapons and combat equipment, and as a rule without subdividing the overall end item into concrete product nomenclatures, overall production and not concrete types of fuel, rolled iron in general, and not separate types of iron, etc. This makes the situation more favorable for the Soviet economy than it was in reality. One of the examples here is aviation fuel. Although the total number was relatively low, yet due to the high octane level it was often used by the Soviets to increase the octane levels of their own fuel by mixing. Of course, it would also be misleading and overly simplistic to just subtract the goods the Western Allies supplied to the Soviet Union and remove them and then note that the Soviets could not have performed certain actions. Because the availability of certain goods and equipment also influences its allocation. In other words, various aspects would have been treated quite differently. Or to give you a real-life example, if you want to go to a concert in another city and you don't have a car, you likely take the train instead of staying at home. Of course, it would have been very difficult and costly for the Soviet economy to have matched the military technical qualities of American vehicles, fuels, communications equipment and food rations. Nonetheless, if the Soviet armed forces had been denied these Western resources, they would have procured replacements. Now the next point is about timing, and here I found plenty of disagreement on many levels by various authors. Now the consensus was for a long time that Lend-Lease had a negligible impact before 1943. More general Western literature and indeed much post-Soviet work in Russian, however, often still assumes that Lend-Lease aid became significant to the Soviet war effort only as deliveries increased from 1943 onwards, particularly in facilitating the forward movement of the Red Army with lorries and other transport resources. Yet this ignores several aspects. First, since the Red Army suffered tremendous losses in 1941, thus in relative terms, every support had way more weight than later on. Second, since in 1941 a large amount of the Soviet industry was relocated, the production was also at the low point for several months. And third, due to the total mobilization, the Soviet economy and society was put under huge pressure that could have led to a collapse of the economy, as it happened with plenty of other countries in both world wars, including Imperial Russia. So let's take a look at winter 1941 and 1942. The British supplied only a rather low number of tanks during the whole war. If Soviet production of tanks and self-propelled guns is taken as 100,340 for the whole war, then 4,542 tanks supplied by Britain might seem unimportant. Yet some of them arrived during a crucial time. The military historian Alexander Hill looked at various statistics as well as the type of tanks. He argues that it is important to remember that the Soviet forces in 1941 didn't consist mostly of T-34s and KV-1s. Quite on the contrary, as such the British Matildas and Valentines were among the better armored tanks the Soviets had at this point. He thus concludes that around 30 to 40% of the medium and heavy tanks of the Red Army forces before Moscow in December 1941 were made up of British tanks. As such, their contribution at this point in time was more important than if one looks at the duration of the whole war. Yet he also notes that the tanks were not decisive in halting the Wehrmacht. Now let's look at the state of the Soviet industry in fall-winter 1941. The situation was quite dire as well. November 1941 was the cruelest month. Red Army strength dropped to its lowest level. Factories relocated in the deep rear had barely started production. Between August and October 1941, 80% of the Russian industry was on wheels. Ammunition plants, tank engine plants, armor plate mills. As such, deliveries of resources and industrial equipment was far more important in the early days of the Lend-Lease than it is often suggested. The United States, Great Britain and Canada provided vast quantities of aluminium, manganese, coal and other materials to replace the supplies captured by the Germans in 1941, thereby allowed Soviet manufacturing to recover much more rapidly than would have otherwise have been the case. On a larger scale, the author Mark Harrison suggests that the collapse of Soviet economy was not unlikely. The history of other wars and other countries suggests that the Soviet economy should have collapsed in 1942. He explains that due to the total mobilization and severe losses in man and material, there was a shortage of various resources and machinery. Additionally, workers needed to be fed and clothed and competed for the same means of subsistence as the soldiers on the front line and the farmers in the rear. As war production climbed, this civilian infrastructure fell away. It is certain that Lend-Lease provided a stabilizing effect, yet how crucial it was is hard to determine. We cannot measure the distance of Soviet economy from the point of collapse in 1942, but it seems beyond doubt the collapse was near. Without Lend-Lease, it would have been nearer. Now, it is also important to quote some notable experts here that think that Lend-Lease was of little to no importance in the early years. Lend-Lease aid did not arrive in sufficient quantities to make a major difference between defeat and victory in 1941 and early 1942. That achievement must be attributed solely to the Soviet people and to the iron nerve of Stalin, Zhukov, Shapovalsky, Vasilevsky and their subordinates. As the war continued, however, the United States and Britain provided many of the implements of war and raw materials necessary for Soviet victory. The Soviet miracle was not due to Western assistance. Lend-Lease did not begin to affect the balance on the Eastern Front until 1943. The best single explanation for this remarkable triumph was the extraordinary concentration of Soviet production on a limited number of weapons produced in a handful of giant factories, permitting the fullest realization of economies of mass production. Yet this aforementioned concentration would have not been possible to such a degree if the Soviet economy would also have to produce various other goods like trucks, fuel and radios. A crucial impact of Lend-Lease was after all the division of labor that allowed such concentration and specialization in production on a multinational scale. Now, a final point why the impact of Lend-Lease is so hard to determine is the sheer variety of goods provided and also how the quantities and composition changed significantly over time. To just give a small example, the United States shipped among a lot of other stuff: medium tanks, graphite powder, steam locomotives, parchment paper, coffee, tires, trucks, smokeless powder, pneumatic floats, canned meat, and also a decent amount of salt. Similarly, the amount of these values changed quite dramatically over the years. Now, beforehand I mentioned that even if we assume perfect numbers, it would be quite hard to determine the proper impact. Well, as you probably have guessed, the numbers are far from perfect. The Russian historian Sokolov raises an interesting question here. It remains completely mysterious how Soviet industry, possessing almost 2 times less the aluminium resources than Germany, could have produced a 1.3 times greater number of combat aircraft, as the structure of aircraft production in the two countries was very similar. He acknowledges that the Soviet aircraft industry used a lot of wood in the construction of aircraft, yet doesn't think that this factor was big enough. Thus he assumes, most likely the point here is that Soviet production of aircraft during the war years was overstated twofold owing to consciously overstated bookkeeping during the war years themselves. And speaking of socialists, at last we take a short look at the political aspects. As we know, after the Second World War, soon the Cold War was started. As such, the former allies, now enemies, were rather reluctant in admitting how much each one contributed. Considering that there was even a controversy between the United Kingdom and the United States, they cooperated much closer and for a far longer time. it is likely that this issue will never be solved. During the Cold War, the Soviets usually noted the only 4% number, which was seen quite ungrateful by the West. Similarly, the Soviets called during the whole war for a second front, which they got, yet from their perspective very late, and looking at the Soviet losses, it is without doubt that their blood toll was by far higher than those of the Western Allies. The British and still more the Americans resented the Russians' economic dependence, the official presumption of moral superiority, and lack of official gratitude. The Russians resented the way their richer partners used their wealth to help the Russians to kill and be killed. Yet it is without question that all allies gained from Lend-Lease, the question of how much, although might never be agreed upon. To summarize, looking at Lend-Lease and just comparing numbers is a rather futile attempt. After all, numbers without context are, like most politicians, quite useless and untrustworthy. Yet even with a perfect data there are several issues. First, the numbers don't account for quality and complexity. For instance, US trucks and radios in many aspects were of higher quality. Second, the approach of just subtracting Lend-Lease aid is also too simplistic, since the availability of certain goods also affected their allocation. Third, the numbers also don't account for timing. The growth from the Soviet Union changed considerably over the years. As such, some aid that might have been crucial at some point, whereas later on it might have been just important or even merely a luxury. Fourth, the extreme variety of aid including yet barely limited to canned meat, trucks, radios, locomotives, aviation fuel makes it extremely hard to determine what influence each had alone, yet even less so in combination. As you can see, simple numbers alone might be quite misleading, but as outlined, we don't have perfect numbers at all. Additionally, the topic was and is politically charged as well. Thank you here to all my Patreons who made these videos possible to be free for everyone. Also a big thank you to Stridwolf, Kirill, Justin and Bismarck for providing valuable intellectual aid to me. As always, sources are linked in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.